Both your home and mine contain plenty of white powder we ignore because it seems ordinary and harmless. These are simply the salt and sugar in our kitchens. Yet these two ingredients, which we use almost everywhere without thinking to season our food, have shaped our palate and even allowed us to build a few of them. For millions of years, these two tastes, sweet and salty, were rare, precious, and eagerly sought after, because we are, like many other animals, conditioned by evolution to be, in a way, addicted to these powders and their tastes, which are much more pleasant to us than bitter or sour flavors. Salt, to begin with, is simply vital for all creatures on Earth. You could even say that land animals, in a way, never really left the sea. They just took the ocean with them. Our bodies, as you know, are mostly made up of water, and we shouldn't forget to add a good pinch of salt to that. Yet, the farther you get from the coast, the rarer salt becomes in the environment. Freshwater species, like land species, have therefore adapted to live with a much lower salt level in their bodies than marine species. But we can never do without it completely, so we remain conditioned to seek it out and consume it day after day. Seawater contains about 35 grams of salt per liter. In other words, nearly 3.5% of the total mass of the oceans is due to the salt dissolved in the water. In our case, it's 0.5% of the total mass that is made up of salt. For a person weighing 70 kilograms, that still represents nearly 70 teaspoons of salt. All terrestrial animal species need it for their cells, muscles, or nervous system to function. That's actually what drives herbivores to lick rocks that contain it, and ants to drink the salt-rich sweat of other animals. Sugar, by contrast, directly fuels our muscles and brain, which reward us whenever we consume it. Plants have actually used its addictive power to make insects work for them in exchange for nectar. They have even managed to make hummingbirds addicted, who spend a lot of time trying to get it, even though they don't have taste receptors for sweetness. Since they descend from a long line of carnivorous birds directly from their dinosaur ancestors. Plants recruit larger animals by coating seeds with sweet flesh, encouraging them to eat and disperse seeds through their digestive tracts. So, in a way, the existence of sugar has indirectly given wings to pollen and legs to seeds. In fact, there is no plant in nature that is both toxic and sweet. So today, we're going to explore the wild stories of these two white powders and dive into the spectacular impacts they've had on humanity. That said, let's return to our two fabulous crystals. Pure sugar and kitchen salt often look so similar you could mistake one for the other. Sisters, these two powders have extremely different origins. What we call sugar is sucrose, and it belongs to the large family of sugars that are also called carbohydrates. This one, sucrose, is actually made up of two sugars, glucose and fructose, which look like this. When we write their chemical formula, these two sugars, we say they are simple, but don't be fooled, nothing is simple when it comes to sugars. They result from organic chemistry, a complex process only living things can perform. In fact, these sugar molecules are so complex that discovering them on another planet would almost instantly prove the presence of life elsewhere in the universe. Sugars are incredibly diverse: ribose, deoxyribose, lactose, starch, chitin, and many more. All these complex molecules are different kinds of sugars. The vast majority of them don't actually taste sweet, but they do have the molecular structure of sugars. Some are used to store energy, others, like chitin, form the exoskeleton of insects, and others are the basis of DNA and ribonucleic acid. Along with proteins and lipids, sugars are the main components of life, whether it's animal, plant, or bacterial. And since it would be impossible to cover the entire diversity of sugars in a single video, here we'll mainly focus on simple sugars, those concentrated sources of energy that are quickly absorbed by the body and that our taste buds love. On the other hand, what we commonly call salt is much simpler. Its chemical formula, NaCl, is strikingly simple compared to that of sugars, even though it also belongs to a much larger chemical family, that of salts. Unlike sugar, finding large amounts of salt on another planet would not be proof of living activity, because salts are the products of what is called inorganic chemistry, the chemistry of minerals. It's fascinating that salt is one of the few rocks people eat. When you consume salt, you're eating minerals. The presence of salt on our planet is closely linked to that of water. And these two components, sodium and chlorine, have their origins in a story that goes back a long way in time. Chlorine was released in large quantities in the form of gas by the intense activity of volcanoes that dotted the globe. This happened nearly 4 billion years ago. Over millions of years, torrential rains gradually removed this element from the atmosphere by dissolving it in water. As for sodium, the other component of table salt, it is present in surface rocks, from which the rains gradually washed some away. Once dissolved in the water, these two elements met. They made our oceans salty and have hardly been separated ever since. Let's clarify that salts, in the chemical sense of the word, are simply crystals made up of two opposite ions that have bonded together. The most famous one, the one we're talking about in this video, is sodium chloride, NaCl, our table salt. There are hundreds of thousands of others, most notably the names now scrolling across the screen. Potassium nitrate, calcium sulfate, sodium carbonate, magnesium chloride, sodium bicarbonate, and magnesium sulfate are all salts. However, these hundreds of thousands of other salts are much rarer in nature. And from a physiological point of view, even though some of them can provide us with essential minerals, they are infinitely less important than sodium chloride. To convince you, consider that when they are dissolved in the water in our bodies, the chlorine and sodium ions separate, and each of them, on their own, will participate in making possible chemical mechanisms that are vital to us. Sodium plays a central role in the processes of nerve transmission and muscle contraction, while chlorine is involved in the production of hydrochloric acid, which is essential for digestion and for regulating the acidity of the blood. And both are essential for maintaining the water balance in our bodies beyond just our table salt. Stools, in the broad sense, almost always need water to form. Because water dissolves minerals, separates and transports ions, concentrates them, and lets them meet and bind, until they accumulate to form crystals, crusts, and deposits. And since it's in water that salts are born, travel, and settle, exploration missions on the planet Mars are trying to detect the presence of salt deposits there. Because where there are salts, there surely was water, and where there was water, there might have been life. See the idea? Sugars are preferred, but salts are still interesting. In the history of our planet, salt comes before sugar, and it's the same in human history. The use and production of salt in the form of crystals or brine, meaning dissolved in water, goes back to the Neolithic era. It's closely tied to settlement and domestication. Because when humans stop chasing game and settle in the first villages, when they become sedentary and domesticate plants and animals, they change their diet with the invention of agriculture. Our ancestors start eating more plants and especially cereals, which are much less rich in salt than meat. And then, with settling down, another huge challenge arises: preserving food, because if you no longer follow wild animals, you can't hunt day by day anymore. So you have to be able to store food in order to get through the bad season, and for that, nothing works better than salt, which allows you to preserve food. People salt meat, fish, and milk, which is used to make cheese. After mastering animal husbandry, salt is even given to animals as a gift, because it boosts the lactation of livestock, which doesn't lack salt. The herd is healthier, produces more milk, and grows faster. In short, in a short time, salt has become both a kind of dietary supplement, a tool for preservation, and a way to improve livestock yields. Sugar, too, is affected by the Neolithic revolution and its waves of domestication, because while many ripe fruits are sweet, most of them used to be much less so, before humans came to add their 2 cents. by selecting plants that produce the biggest, juiciest, and most sugar-filled fruits. And while salt is essential, sugar is infinitely desirable. It drives us to extremes because, unlike salt, nothing in our brain or palate signals there's too much. Throughout most of history, people got their sweet, rich flavors from honey, which had to be collected from bees. Of course, we're not the only ones addicted enough to risk getting stung by their stingers. But we're the only ones who have domesticated these insect societies in the hope of enjoying their miraculous production. Powdered sugar, known for its pure and irresistible taste, originates from sugarcane, which the Arabs called the reed that produces honey without bees. This tall tropical grass, which can reach between 2 and 6 meters in height, originates from New Guinea, where it has been cultivated by humans since the Neolithic era. It quickly spread to the neighboring islands, but you had to enjoy it quickly because sugarcane spoils fast. Several millennia before Jesus Christ, it was found in the west of China and India, and it was there, in India, around 500 before Christ, that innovators, who will remain forever unknown, found a way to press its juice on a large scale. And by boiling it and then cooling it, they obtained crystallized sucrose, almost pure, which could then be stored or transported in chests or jars. The sugar industry was born. The Europeans then discovered the existence of this plant thanks to Neolithic, admiral of Alexander the Great, who, in 325 before Christ, traveled to India. But they can't taste it yet, since sugarcane doesn't grow in the dry climates of Eastern Middle Eastern countries. It took centuries for major irrigation projects in Iran, Iraq, and Syria to enable sugarcane to adapt and spread to the Mediterranean. In 800 AD, the Crusaders truly discovered cane sugar in Jerusalem, and they became completely crazy about it, to the point of building colonial empires just to get it in large quantities. But before telling you about this crazy story, let's go back to salt, which led to the growth of cities all over the world. Take Venice. By the 10th century, the city gained much of its wealth from producing large amounts of salt in its lagoons. To export this valuable commodity, the city of the Doges set up both sea and land routes, even imposing a monopoly. Every foreign ship that docks must sell its salt to Venice, which then resells it for a profit. As a result, the trade of its crystals finances its fleet, its palaces, its influence, and the city gradually becomes a major commercial hub in the Mediterranean. Because along the salt route it controls, silks, spices, and porcelain from the distant east also travel. But salt is not only extracted from salt marshes, it can also be mined, like in Salzburg, Austria, which literally means the castle of salt. Its prosperity comes from salt mines exploited in the Alps since the Bronze Age. Or in Hallstatt, a city built at the foot of one of the oldest salt mines in the world, which roads have turned into an important commercial crossroads. The world's largest active salt mine is beneath Lake Huron in Canada. This deposit, which was formed nearly 430 million years ago, at a time when plants and arthropods were just beginning to colonize the land, is now located nearly 500 meters underground. And from these 160 kilometers of tunnels, the 600 miners and their machines extract 8 million tons of salt per year. The next time you buy Himalayan salt, keep in mind that it most likely comes from the Kerwa mine, located in the foothills of Punjab in northern Pakistan, 300 kilometers from the world's highest peaks. This is where this fossil salt is extracted, which is twice as old as the salt from the Godrich mine. It was formed by the evaporation of an inland sea. That was 800 million years ago, before the Himalayas brought it back to the surface. Which, by the way, doesn't give it any special properties, but it does allow you to add a bit of history to your dishes. Each grain of salt you eat is a mineral archive dissolved in the soup. You might be surprised, as I was, that of the 400,000 tons of salt mined annually, only 30 are used for food. The rest is used in industry, mainly in cosmetics or road salting. In Europe, several salt mines are so vast that they even house churches carved directly into the salt deposits. Just like the St. Kinga Chapel, which was consecrated inside the spectacular Wieliczka mine located in Poland, the presence of all these salt mines does not depend on the climate. They can be found scattered all around the world, where, at very different times in the history of our planet, shallow oceans once existed. After the tectonic plates shifted and waters evaporated, layers of salt crystals remained trapped under the sediments. All these mining towns owe their prosperity to the way the earth preserves the memory of the sea, sometimes a very ancient memory. In some places, these phenomena are still ongoing, like in the Sala de Uyuni, which is a salt mountain lake that disappeared only 14,000 years ago in Bolivia. As vast as Jamaica, this spectacular salt landscape, perched at over 3,000 meters above sea level, is now the largest exposed salt crust on the surface of our planet. I mentioned salt's importance in European societies, but it was equally vital in America before Europeans arrived. The Mayas extracted salt from the marshy coastal areas of the Yucatan Peninsula. In the Valley of Mexico, the Aztecs used salt water from Texcoco and Zumpango lakes. But it is in the Andes that one of the most spectacular salt extraction sites can be found, the Maras salt mines, which were already being used in the pre-Inca period. At 3,300 meters hot, salt water emerges from deep inside the mountain. Pools are then created to allow deposits to form through evaporation. This unique site, which has existed for nearly a millennium, still supplies salt to the Cusco region today, and from there to the whole of Peru. In America, the quest for sugar greatly impacted the continent, as sugar was a main force behind colonization. And that's not a metaphor. This endless craving for sweetness led to the depopulation of one continent and the enslavement of another. To really understand why, let's go back a bit to the Middle Ages. Sugar was part of the European elite's fascination with the East, just like pepper or ginger. It could only be found on the tables of nobles, who, in seeking to obtain it, enriched the Crusaders, who, in the Holy Land, developed a new system of production, plantations, which are large estates dedicated solely to export, requiring processing before export and a significant labor force. In sugarcane plantations, what systems did Muslim societies create around the Mediterranean that Christians later took over and exploited? The strong need for labor generally pushes the owners to pay workers well to ensure their presence at the key moment of production, at least at first. But everything will change in 15th century Madeira, an island off the African coast that was uninhabited before the Portuguese arrived. The very steep terrain makes farming the land difficult and requires major terracing and irrigation work. After this work is complete, sugarcane production surges, causing sugar prices to collapse by the late 15th century. At the same time, Christopher Columbus accidentally lands in the Caribbean and no one realizes that he has just discovered a new continent. In Madeira, to maintain their profit, the plantation owners decide to increase production, but they lack labor on the island. They turn to slaves. A decision that will reshape the world, as slavery was once mainly a display of wealth before plantations. The most powerful, Christian or Muslim, owned few and mainly used them for domestic work, not agriculture. But the arrival of huge sugarcane plantations changes the model. In the late 15th century, Madeira's slaves were mostly convicts, North African Berbers, or natives of the Canary Islands. However, a new factor will change things at the end of the 15th century. On the tropical islands of Principe and São Tomé, where much sugar cane is grown, malaria and yellow fever are widespread. And while the much coveted plants grow well there, the populations of European and North African origin who work there die by the thousands and quickly. Large numbers of slaves from the Gulf of Guinea are bought by Portuguese plantation owners. Because these populations are much more resistant to the diseases that decimate Europeans on the plantations, where the number of slaves soars and violence often reigns supreme. It's a story of sugar and blood that begins and spans nearly 400 years across the Atlantic, from the mid-15th to the late 19th century. It is estimated that the Portuguese, Spanish, French, English, and Dutch will deport over 12.5 million captives, from Africa to the Americas and Atlantic islands. Over 1.5 million people die before reaching land during the crossing. Like in São Tomé, people of African descent have long outnumbered Europeans in the Americas. From the earliest days of slavery, many escape and mix with the Indian populations, who are also enslaved. After almost 400 years of violence in Haiti, the Great Glorious Revolt begins. Saint-Domingue is by far the most profitable colony, producing over half the world's sugar on the eve of the French Revolution. On these plantations, operating at full capacity due to industrial brutality, 500,000 Africans are enslaved by a few wealthy white landowners. But in 1791, after years of political turmoil, everything changes as the ideas of liberty, equality, and fraternity spread. In the era of revolution, the Maroons, who are not given to the runaway slaves, take up arms, and many of those still on the plantations rise up. Led by powerful figures like Toussaint Louverture, the movement spreads for over a decade. The fighting is intense and repression fierce. France, Spain, and even England get involved, but the former slaves no longer back down. And in 1804, after years of war, Haiti completes the only slave revolt in modern history to have resulted in independence, and becomes the first free black republic in the world. Abolishing slavery for good on its soil, in the years following Haiti's independence, France continues to receive sugar from its other colonies. During the Napoleonic Wars, the English maritime blockade isolated continental Europe from much of the world. Without sugar coming from the West Indies or Réunion to sink their teeth into, continental Europe then develops an alternative to sugarcane, the sugar beet. And the arrival of these new plantations, whose production quickly becomes industrial, will make sugar a more accessible commodity and better distributed throughout the world. If the history of sugar is deeply linked to slavery, is the history of salt strongly linked to taxation? And that history too is marked by violence and revolts, even if they are hardly comparable to the horrors of the slave trade. In Europe, salt has been used as currency since ancient times. Roman soldiers received a salarium, a salt bonus, which is the origin of the word salary. Salt routes spanned continents, linking Timbuktu to the Maghreb, the Adriatic Sea to Central Europe, and Venice to the Alpine Pass, with mules carrying white gold. In China, salt was distributed via canals, letting the empire control it. A monopoly that allowed the Chinese emperors both to collect taxes and to impose control over the population. Globally, salt has been vital for preservation, livestock, and consumption. In Tibet, yak caravans often cross the Himalayas, while in the Sahara, dromedary caravans travel legendary routes carrying salt slabs. And since salt is also a commodity that can't be substituted, it makes it a perfect product to tax, a kind of value-added tax of the old regimes. For more than 4 centuries, in France, this tax had a name, the gabelle. Established in 1342, this levy evolved into one of the old regime's most unpopular taxes. The gabelle was officially abolished early in the French Revolution, after lasting almost 450 years. And this tax was enough to drive people crazy, because it applied not only to the purchase, but also to the possession of salt. Even worse, it required you to buy a mandatory amount, even if you didn't need it. So, every person over the age of 7 had to buy a minimum amount of salt per year, at a price set by the state and well above the market rate. The Kingdom of France was divided into tax zones, with some regions having high salt taxes and others lower salt taxes. And finally, the redeemed regions, which had bought their exemption from the salt tax and no longer paid it at all. From this territorial mess, a thriving smuggling trade was born. Salt was frequently smuggled across France's internal borders, so the state formed a special militia to stop it. The gabelous, who were seen as traitors to the people, were tasked with seizing transported salt and hunting down smugglers to imprison them and sometimes even sentence them to death. It should be noted that in the 18th century, the gabelle accounted for nearly 10% of the monarchy's revenue, a vital tax for the crown, but a burden for the people. This unfairness sparked several uprisings, some now remembered in history. In 1548, during the Pitos Revolt in southwest France, tax collectors were killed, warehouses burned, and over 300 rebels were hanged in a harsh crackdown. Almost a century later, in 1639, Normandy was rocked by revolt. Barefoot men, peasants, craftsmen, and even priests march barefoot as a sign of poverty and rise up against the strengthening of the salt tax. The central government violently crushes the revolt, and the royal army kills several hundred men and destroys entire villages. Injustice can't be solved by authoritarianism. In 1789, the French Revolution erupted for many reasons. Salt played its part a century and a half later. On the other side of the hemisphere, in India, it's once again salt that crystallizes anger and fuels revolt with just a handful of salt. A history that sends shivers down your spine. In 1930, the largest empire the world had ever seen, India was still under British rule. And among all the injustices imposed by colonization, there is one, modest in appearance, but unbearable in daily life. The salt monopoly. At that time, it was forbidden for an Indian to produce or harvest their own salt. All salt crystals, including those that the waves leave for free on the shore, must be controlled and taxed by the colonial administration. Gandhi will respond to this injustice by leading the historic Salt March, a major act of non-violent resistance. On March 12, 1930, he leaves Sabarmati Ashram with 78 companions walking toward the Arabian Sea. As this 390-kilometer procession moves through Gujarat's villages, it is increasingly followed, filmed, commented on, and watched worldwide. Gandhi and his companions advance silently, gaining more followers at each stage. Thousands of peasants, intellectuals, and workers join the procession. After 24 days of marching, Gandhi finally reaches the sea, bends down, and picks up a handful of salt on the beach. A tiny gesture with immense symbolic significance, because taking this salt without paying the tax is an illegal act. This march paves the way for hundreds of similar actions across the country. People start producing, trading, and selling salt. By disobeying British laws, the colonial administration reacts harshly. More than 60,000 people are arrested, and Gandhi is sent to prison, where he will remain for 9 months. But the seed is sown in India. This Salt March is a turning point. Proof that non-violence can break even the greatest powers draws global attention. For the Indian cause, it unites the independence movement and pressures the British Empire to negotiate. Sometimes just a march, some salt, and a crowd remembering freedom are enough. Nearly a century has passed since the Salt March. Today, most countries are afflicted, newly emerged in so-called consumer societies where free competition drives manufacturers to try to sell us more and more. Even if, for that, they have to make their consumers captive, dependent, and partly sick, and to develop voluntary servitude. Nothing works better than sugar, not just in the form of sucrose, but also glucose, fructose, corn syrup, maltodextrin, or disguised lactose. According to the World Health Organization, our excessive consumption of free sugars, meaning those added to processed foods, is largely responsible for a massive pandemic of diabetes, obesity, and cardiovascular diseases. Today, around the world, more than 2 billion people are overweight. Excess weight and a sedentary lifestyle cause diseases like type 2 diabetes, because, After being exposed to too much sugar, the pancreas, which produces insulin, the hormone that regulates its levels in the body, becomes exhausted. The consequences of this loss of effectiveness are both severe and numerous: trouble healing, vision issues, kidney failure, heart attack, or stroke. And the most insidious part of all this is that diabetes increases the feeling of thirst and hunger, creating a never-ending vicious cycle. Expenses from these diseases, which mainly impact the poorest people in wealthy countries, are estimated at billions of dollars annually. Salt also causes problems for most of us, though less severely. Our kidneys handle the excess without issue. But some people, like those with high blood pressure, the elderly, or heart and kidney patients, see their cardiovascular system worsen each year. Because when we eat too much salt and the kidneys can't get rid of the excess, we retain more water, which increases blood pressure and damages the entire plumbing system. While the heart has to beat more forcefully with each pulse to supply the body with blood. Knowing this, you might think the solution to these problems is simple: just reduce the amount of salt and sugar. But that would be forgetting that these two white powders, once rare and now abundant, hold a special place in our craving machine. They are implanted in our brains by millions of years of evolutionary conditioning and, at great marketing expense, by the industries that use our desires to build their empires. Two elements, one from dried up oceans and seas, telling a slow story of underground deposits, the other from sap that rises and crystallizes. It reveals living beings, their often dark history, and how they work, proving the extraordinary hides in everyday life. Two elements stored in your cupboards, which contain a little bit of a great story that I hope you enjoyed.